Hello and welcome to another Imperfectly Perfect Conversation for the Flourishing Education podcast. Today I'm delighted to bring you our new guest, Pen. A very warm welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. So, for the listeners, disclaimer, sometimes I don't know the guests as well, but Pen and I are both doing a PhD in the same school of education. So I know Pen, which hopefully will make the conversation even more enjoyable because there's that already sort of like connection and trust, right? But for the listeners, because they don't know you, would you tell us a little bit more about you? So where are you in the world? What's been who are you and what's been your journey in education so far?
Okay, guys, yeah, it's a big question, isn't it? Who are you? I am based in Bristol, in the southwest of England, and I've lived here for most of my life. The majority of my life has been here, and my research is based here too, very locally. So I'm very much rooted and grounded in this part of the world, and I feel very much at home here. It's important to me. I started teaching secondary English back in 2004-ish, and taught in secondary schools for about 20 years, and then taught in post-16 colleges for a little while after that. But always taught subject English and had a turbulent relationship with the subject and the curriculum, I think, as my career went on. And did a master's part-time at Bristol in the international development and policy pathway for education, and it just really opened my eyes. Or I don't know if it opened my eyes so much as it just made me acknowledge to myself things I already knew, but made me challenge perhaps my place in education at that time and my role and the role I wanted to play. And so when I got the opportunity to do the PhD, that was very much the right thing for me. And so I work on citizenship education, not subject English, as a sort of divergence from where I've come from. And I work with post-16 students. So that's students in what used to be non-compulsory education in the UK, but it's recently become a compulsory part of education. And that was really it might not be my specialist subject, but that really was my specialist age group. I was subject leader for Key Stage 5 and had worked with post-16 students. So it's the age group, if not the subject, is very much in keeping with my background. Yeah, so that's kind of where I am at the moment.
Yeah, no, amazing. And so what year are you in your PhD?
Year 4,
Final year.
coming towards the end. Yeah, writing up at the moment.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so we'll come to the PhD in a minute, but um, I I call myself a recovering language teacher because I guess I feel there's many things I feel about the education system that I wish I'd been taught, that I discovered, later on. Um, so you mentioned sort of like your relationship education and sort of like moving from teaching English to then from secondary schools to post-16 to then doing global citizenship, or citizenship is not rather than global citizenship, or both.
Um, I'm both really. Yeah.
Yeah.
Been
Okay.
talking.
Okay. Cool. So can we linger on your journey, like in education, before we then have a look at the language and what we mean by citizenship and all of those things? So it sounds to me like you've also transitioning. So I call myself a recovering language teacher, and I'm sort of slowly transitioning into becoming a social psychologist and stepping into the identity. Is that what it feels like for you, or is it different?
No, absolutely. For years after leaving secondary school, I described myself as in recovery, the exact same phrase. So I totally identify with that. As you know, I remember when I was doing my master's reading an article on performativity in teaching and it resonating with me really strongly. And yeah, I think, having started teaching, over 20 years ago now, there was a very different feeling about the subject that I was teaching. There was a very different feeling in schools. Obviously, there was a different government, it was funded differently. I had lots and lots of opportunities as a young teacher. And by young, I mean, obviously in my career, not just in terms of being younger. And you go through so many iterations of curriculum, so much reform, so many times the GCSE was changed, and it became further and further removed from the subject that I had wanted to teach. I wanted to teach English. I taught English as a foreign language in the Czech Republic, what was when it was like EFL, and I back in just after the millennium. And that's what made me think, oh, I'd love to teach. And English seemed like the logical subject, although my undergraduate degree is actually in women's studies. So it was English and media. So I did a conversion course to teach English. So so obviously I had possibly a political or politicized view of the subject already. And as the curriculum sort of distanced itself from my sort of maybe my natural sort of home, it became harder for me to teach it sort of from a very genuine place. And I think that was the problem for me. So yeah, I found that difficult. And sort of weirdly, teaching post 16, it was retake classes I was teaching. So I wasn't teaching A level, I was teaching people who hadn't got their, the necessary qualification in English, who had to have those lessons for funding and because they would probably need it to apply for jobs. And I found that easier to rationalize in terms of teaching the GCSE and the functional skills qualification, because I was teaching it as a functional thing. You need this in order to do what you want to do next, rather than when I was in a secondary school classroom teaching it as a subject for its own sake. So there's a very strange relationship, and I do a little bit of that still now. I teach a little bit of functional English in vocational settings. And as I say, I find it easier to rationalize than if I was teaching it as a subject for the love of the subject, almost, if that makes sense.
Yeah, completely. Because it just, you're supporting those who perhaps have been failed by the system, right? And sort of like helping them find a way
Yeah.
to gain the qualifications that our society has deemed as being essential, like a GCSE or functional. I mean, would you explain to our listeners, they might not understand the difference between a GCSE and a functional skills. So could we just linger here very briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the GCSE is I suppose it would be considered the academic English subject. So for the GCSE, the young people are looking at extracts not only of fiction, but also of unseen 19th century non-fiction, and they're expected to analyse that in the exam. And that's for everybody at 16 or nearly 16 will do that. If they don't achieve the grade 4, they either retake it or they do the functional qualification. And the functional qualification does have reading and writing still, but it also has a spoken component, which the GCSE doesn't have in the same way anymore. And it also, all the texts that they come across, or most of the texts they come across, are based in things they will encounter. So they'll be asked to write emails, or they might still be asked to write an article, but the idea is that the topics are more relevant to the working world and to the world of being an adult. That's sort of the main difference.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know if it's your experience, but a lot of the young people in the Teenage Hub that I help co-found, even though like this year I'm not, I'm not part of it anymore. A lot of the young people who can't be in school for different reasons tend to prefer taking the functional skills because it's more practical and perhaps less academic, or academically sort of like, a lot of the demands of the GCSE sometimes don't work with some of our learners, right?
Right, absolutely. And I think, and the way that it's assessed is different as well. Like it's shorter bursts of assessment. They can be assessed on the computer for functional skills. There's still an element of classroom assessment in the spoken component, but it is, I think, for a lot of students who struggled in mainstream for various reasons, whether it's attendance, whether it's, you know, whatever it is, it's a more accessible form of assessment, I think.
Amazing. So moving to your master's and then obviously your PhD. So you've used words, and I've added global, but it's citizenship and then obviously global citizenship. So, you know, recovering language teacher, once a linguist, always a linguist. I always go back to words and descriptions. So could you give us descriptors for those two words so that the listeners and I can understand what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has kind of become quite an important discussion within my writing at the moment. When I did my master's, I was drawn to the inclusion of the Sustainable Development Goals in for students within Key Stage 4, which is the time when they're being assessed for their GCSEs. And the reason why I was so keen on this is because I felt that my experience as a teacher and having a tutor group, having a pastoral responsibility, I'd always been really interested in the citizenship aspect of it, in terms of active citizenship and getting involved in your community and in issues that were important locally but also nationally. But really important to me had been trying to open up my students' awareness of things outside of the local area and outside of the UK. I worked in a really interesting semi-rural school where some students were still like taking days off to go poaching with their father. Sometimes, like, it was a very local and very sort of traditional environment. And I mean, as I said, it was a different world when I started teaching. I got some funding to go with a group of other teachers to Kenya and visit some schools in Kenya and talk to teachers in Kenya. And I came back completely, like, I know people say things like change your life, but really in retrospect, I think it really did change the trajectory of my teaching and of where I was going. And I really wanted to bring this to my students, my tutor group especially. And we did loads of stuff around international schools, and I got the International Schools Award. I did an audit, and that's where I became interested in global citizenship outside of the statutory citizenship curriculum, which is largely around, not entirely, but largely around active citizenship, social action and democracy and democratic education, sort of a civic education, really. And I suppose, I mean, my thinking around that has developed quite a bit from when I was teaching it, but definitely that to me is the distinction, is that citizenship as we see it in the UK at the moment, where it's, you know, where it is compulsory and it isn't compulsory all the way through, is to do with there's democracy, there's also financial education in there, but the problem is it gets taught with other subjects. It gets kind of lumped in with PSHE, which is personal, social and health education. And then when you get to post-16, where I'm working now, it's not statutory, and so it just gets fitted in really differently in every school and within schools as well. So sorry, I went rather off topic there.
No, but that's super interesting, because that gives such a beautiful sort of like overview of where it fits in. And so, you know, you mentioned also like the global goals, right? Like the UN global goals. So how does that all fit in with what you're currently, or like your study and the work you're doing with your PhD?
Right. So I wrote about, for my master's, how I worked with a couple of groups of young people, and we looked at where they were coming across the information that was relevant to the SDGs and whether or not they were able to talk about it and use it in a way which helped them sort of put ideas together or think critically about ideas. What sort of inevitably, I suppose, I found, and I was kind of expecting to find it, I was still working in secondary schools at the time, was that every bit of information they came across around any of the SDGs, so whether it be to do with poverty or to do with, you know, food insecurity or environmental issues around, you know, life on land or the sea, they did, like, the expression is, oh, we did that in geography. We did it. It was a little bubble of knowledge that they'd learned about, and they knew what they needed to say in the exam about it. They hadn't really thought about it elsewhere. And I had expected more of them to say that they'd encountered it in pastoral situations. They'd had discussions, like my view as a tutor back when I'd started teaching, but it didn't really come up in pastoral pastoral learning. Cultural things had come up in MFL lessons, French, for example. And then some students talked about having been on holiday and coming across certain issues while they were traveling, or having seen a documentary. Some had seen things on social media. But basically, there was nowhere for them in the curriculum to talk about all of these different things and to value the knowledge they'd gained at home or traveling or from their friends or social media. And when I say value, to value the importance of that to them, whether or not it's fact checked or not is a different issue, but they, and how they then chose to act. And it really seemed to me like there was a huge gap that wasn't happening. And so that's really what inspired the PhD, was to think about where citizenship and global citizenship, of course, when I was looking at the SDGs, was really important, because I was looking at global citizenship and education for sustainable development as a vehicle to discuss these things. And so I thought, I want to look at post-16 and see if we can have some kind of space where we can start bringing all those different, all of that knowledge from all of those different places together, where it can be valued, where it can be discussed, connections can be made, and something positive will come out of it in terms of developing a sort of critical perspective. And so that was the journey, really, between the master's and the PhD. And I think that is really what I am addressing. And I have, in a very, very small way with my fieldwork, what I did manage to achieve was quite an interesting space where those things could happen. So yeah.
Amazing. And I think what's really interesting is, I'm thinking like the young people I often talk to, in that they often, I don't know whether that emerged in your work or if both at master's or PhD level, but the whole like eco-anxiety, and how so many young people don't quite know how to deal with their feelings over like the state of our planet, and and all that. So has that also emerged in your work?
Yeah, it has. I think it's emerged in the context of a bigger sense of feeling powerless. So eco anxiety definitely was there. It didn't come up. I was actually expecting it to be more prevalent as a sort of thing in itself, but it was definitely part of a conversation around not being heard, not knowing how to be heard, feeling kind of a little bit hopeless and a little bit powerless, and the anxiety that induces in them. And that was very much around the environment. And some young people felt quite angry about the way that older generations spoke to them about, oh, well, it's your problem, we'll be dead by the time that happens, was one of the comments that I was getting. Another one was around this blind faith that a lot of adults seem to have, that the younger generation will sort it all out, that they'll save the world, it'll be fine, and this kind of rests on their shoulders. They do feel the pressure of that, and I think that for the young people I was talking to, that was the cause of a lot of the anxiety, was this, it's on you, and we have, you'll sort it out, it'll be fine. And I think for some of them, they found they resented that, and I can quite see where they were coming to that perspective.
And it's a lot of pressure, right? Like for the mess that we adults have created, right? I find it quite awful that that's how it responds, right? Oh, you wise people sort it out, right?
Yeah. And I think that's so much we have to avoid when we're talking about climate change education specifically. And that's not my specific area, but I have thought about it quite a bit. We have to avoid that sense of, we're teaching you so you can save the world, and the rhetoric around the education to meet the challenges of the future is super important, but it's important that we're not doing that in a way which is a burden, I think. And it's very easy being on the, age this side of it to see it that way and to just be quite glib about it, I think, for a lot of people. And a lot of people's parents are saying, the young people I was talking to, this is a conversation they were having with their mum or their gran or whatever. So yeah, they definitely felt the pressure.
Yeah, I can imagine. So I'm conscious that you're writing up for your PhD.
Mm.
And so what can you tell us? Is what I'm gonna say. And then I'll leave it for you to share what you feel is the most appropriate.
Well, I think, what can I tell you? I think I had started out in this process of the PhD, coming from the idea that there needed to be this critical space. My head was very much that this was going to be an outdoors education endeavour, and it was going to try and bridge the gap between the ideas of social justice and environmental justice or ecological justice. And I was very much coming with that in mind. And I had planned to do something which completely fell through. And I ended up doing something quite different with a similar research question in terms of young people's views on citizenship and the ideas that were important to them. But it sort of took a very different turn. And one of the reasons why is because just as I started the fieldwork, there was a general election called in the UK. And I suppose rather magnificently, this became the backdrop for my fieldwork. So my fieldwork took place between late April and early July 2024, and the election was called early May. So I'd had first two bits of fieldwork before the election was called. We knew it was coming, and we'd spoken a little bit about voting and about representation and about how much citizenship fitted into that for them, but it became really prevalent in the subsequent conversations, and it became really prevalent and also really important in my thinking, because I realized that when we're thinking about citizenship education and when we're thinking about local, national and global citizenship education as perhaps three different things which you could see as nested or you could see as connected in some way, that actually when you chuck democracy into the works, you end up with a very different conversation, because democratic education in schools is limited. And I spoke to lots of young people who didn't feel they knew how to participate. They started off by seeming, a lot of people think that young people don't care, they're not interested, they're apathetic, or they don't know, and they're not inclined to find out. What I came away with was this idea that that's not it at all. It's confidence, it's hopelessness, it's not having the opportunity to stop and think about it. And I suppose what I'm really taking away, and the thing I can share around the research, is that having a space to bring these things together. So in a way, my earliest thoughts were kind of right, that having this space to bring things together is going to be really powerful. And the confidence from the beginning of these conversations with people saying, I don't really know, this isn't a subject I know anything about, I've never really thought about it, to the end of the research process where young people were creating things to be displayed in public, which were directly asking really important and significant questions about the environment, about political representation, about individualism versus collective action. They were really thinking about these things in the space of 3 reasonably short workshops, because they were just given the opportunity. That's what they needed, was just the chance to have the conversation. And we're very concerned, aren't we, in schools, with fragmenting time, allocating time, people knowing what they're doing, having an assessment to work out whether or not what we've done has worked with these young people. And actually, if you're looking at opinion formation, or some writers consider it to be value creation, you're not actually trying to assess them on something. You want them to be able to just continue to question, to, like we talked about social media, to be able to question whether or not that social media piece of information is relevant, valid, true, whether or not the action you're being encouraged to take is desirable or legal, or if you're going to protest, is it legal? Is it a risk worth taking? To the extent that on the subject of protests, we had one group talking about how they were fully aware that them protesting put them in a precarious position, whereas someone who had retired could protest with less ramifications because they weren't going to be looking for work, or they weren't going to be in a position where that was going to be dragged up. There were also conversations around the fact that they felt that certain groups within society were more at risk of when they protested, and that more privileged groups protested in a performative way. They were very aware of that. And so I think there was so much that came out of it, and so much confidence just through having that space, that was really powerful to watch.
And I love what you're sharing, because that fits in so well with like my PhD and what I want to do. So the participatory action research with young people, and this idea that what I was hearing in what you were sharing reminded me of this relentless pace that we have in education, right? Like how I I know that some people find it a bit annoying when I say that, but when people ask me, "Are you busy?" I always say no. Like I don't do busy, because I removed busy out of my vocabulary 5 years ago. Because I refuse to be this little cog in a machine that just like so performative. Do you know what I mean? Um, and in our schools, and everywhere, in all the settings, everybody's so busy doing, and so what I'm hearing is that you've created a space for these young people to you know start having conversations that are different conversations from what they're used to having as well. Because in
Yeah,
school, it's also about great question, but not now because we haven't got time. Or it's not in the curriculum, so we're not going to talk about that, right? Um, so
yeah.
does that sound like a true representation of like what that space was for you?
Yeah, it does. And I think it was really interesting because I did take the conversations outdoors because I wanted them to be removed from the classroom. I didn't want the classroom to be the space where we were having the conversation. And I tried to not to be as removed from the conversation as possible. It's impossible to say that I wasn't involved, because obviously I was there, and they were gonna, especially at the beginning, is this right? Is this what we're supposed to be talking about? So I tried to distance myself from that role. In a few of the centres that I was in, teachers actually wanted to be part of it and wanted to come along. And I didn't, for various reasons, whether it was, just they were nosy, or they were interested, or, whatever. I didn't tell them they couldn't. And it was really interesting to see how the students actually, once we were outside of the classroom, they weren't that fazed by having the teachers there. They weren't that interested in the teachers' comments. It was almost like the teacher would interject, and they were respectful, but they wouldn't let that change the direction of their conversation. And that was really nice to see. I think that they felt that out, in the environment that they were working in, they could have the teacher there, but they weren't leading the conversation. And for the most part, there weren't many students who didn't say anything. Most people sort of chipped in something. There were some extremely confident students, like extremely confident, and some who, gathered that confidence as it went through. But I really feel that being outdoors, being away from the classroom, having the opportunity to have that conversation without a teacher facilitating it was really powerful and really important, and gave them the chance to bring in, or my nan said this, or I saw this on TV, or when I was on holiday, I want to do this, or my sister used to work in a bar in Tenerife and she said, like about the whole Brexit, whatever came up, we had personal experiences as well as curriculum learned experiences that were as valuable and as valued within the conversation. And I think that, rather than moving on quickly, as you said, and going, oh, we don't really have time to discuss that now, or that's going to derail the conversation or the lesson. As a teacher, I can't have them discuss it. Those were the things that directed the conversation. And I think that was refreshing, I think, for them. And it was refreshing for me, having worked as a teacher for so many years, to not have to direct that conversation. It was, a really lovely thing to do.
And I think, like, because the podcast is about like being and becoming, what I'm hearing in this sharing is how each individual has grown and changed and developed, and from where they started. So it's like meeting the individual where they're at, with bringing whatever it is they bring, on their journey, and then not really wanting them to get, unlike in school, right? Like this is where we need you to be at the end, ideally like a level 4 for your GCSEs, for example, right? What I'm hearing is that actually there was none of that. So it's sort of trusting that the individuals will grow and develop and take from those conversations what they need, and and their thinking and possibly their doing and their being would change in the process.
Yeah, and I think there's a real tension between getting these kind of spaces any traction and any any time for them within or on the outskirts of the curriculum, and putting things, as I say, post 16, the conversations around these topics are non-statutory, so we could afford to do that in an extracurricular space that was slightly less rigid in terms of outcome. At Key Stage 4, where it's also not particularly consistent in delivery, when students are 15, 16, there is a GCSE, not everybody takes it. And of course, the minute you make it compulsory and you make it a GCSE, it then becomes subject to all of the constraints or around assessment, but it also gets the privilege of time and investment and money. So if a school decides to deliver citizenship, they're going to get curriculum time, although not, if you read the reports, not as much curriculum time as other subjects. It's probably not going to get specialised teachers because the PGCE was not as long lived as was hoped back in the early 2000s. And so as a result, you have that sort of trade-off between making this an assessed and therefore status holding subject, and having it non-statutory, not assessed, and therefore more open to a critical dialogue. And and part of what I'm now thinking about as I'm writing up is where that, what do we do with that? Where do we go with that? Especially in the light of the other thing that's happened during the course of doing the PhD is the votes at 16 manifesto promise is kind of coming through now, and we're looking at that in the next couple of years or few years. And so what will happen is it will again become really focused on democratic education, which is understandable and necessary. We need that education. But because of political impartiality for teachers and because of an assessed status, where do we put the criticality? Where does that go? How does it happen? There isn't time for it, in my experience. And so, and I mean that as a practitioner, that's kind of my opinion, my sort of lived experience. And I suppose my master's would suggest that there wasn't room for it at Key Stage 4 as well. And I don't think I've read anything which suggests there is a lot of space for it. So where I am at the moment is kind of looking at the fruitfulness of what I've done with this very small, very localized intervention. It's by no means generalizable. It's I could walk to pretty much all of these venues from my house. It's very local, but it's at the same time, how do I transfer that into something which is very standardized, very statutory, very formalized? Yeah. that's what my head is pondering all the time.
Yeah, I can imagine. And it's, of course, and I'm what I'm hearing in that criticality that you're talking about, like there's so much, right? Because if we're gonna ask, or if like young people have said they want to vote younger, let's say when they're 16, right? I mean, I know my eldest who's turning 18 would be one such young person. He feels very strongly. He has opinions and he wants to express his opinions through voting. The minute he was able to, he registered to get a right to vote, but of course, not all young people are like him. There's a lot of people who, like his brother, probably couldn't. He's not that bothered. Um, and so, to me, what I'm hearing and what you're sharing is like, how do we make that? If all young people are going to be voting at 16, how do we have those really important conversations about like the democratic and the you know so there's that first, and then there's the point that you were talking about, like social justice and
Mm.
and then linking to whose narrative are we using as
Yeah,
in like to talk about even like the UN sustainable goals, right? From whose lens, right? So if we start
absolutely.
with that first question, and then maybe we can just look a bit at the social justice, if that
Yeah.
works.
So in terms of not all young people being interested around that, yeah, I mean, I think that for me, because I did one of the questions I did ask, because it became so important in the conversations we're having, was I did say, you don't have to tell me if you don't want to, and you certainly don't have to tell me who, but if you were able to vote in this election, would you, just as a kind of, and just as a starting point for conversation. And I would say the majority, it was almost 50-50, I would say, down the middle. It's not a quantitative study, but just from listening, about half said yes, half said no. And almost everyone who said no said it's because they didn't know who they'd vote for, because they didn't understand what the different parties stood for. They couldn't see the difference between them. Some of them said they didn't trust them. Some of them said they didn't really like them. They weren't doing anything. Some of them said they hate us. Why do they hate us, young people? Why are they doing these things to us? But a lot of them said, I just don't know, and I wouldn't want to make a mistake. I wouldn't want to waste a vote. And it, and I just felt really sad that was the perspective. Was that it was like they, one of them actually said, our voices aren't really respected as much. And I thought that's really interesting. That's like your perception, and it's possibly a very accurate perception from the political point of view. They weren't listening to young people because young people weren't voting. And so I think they felt hopeful that by giving them the vote, they would become a more important demographic. And things like, at the time, the whole discussion around national service and things was happening, and they felt really strongly that they didn't that wasn't something they wanted, especially one group. And I think they felt that it was just a promise that the government could make and throw away because they couldn't vote or say anything about it. So I feel like that were the two sides of the coin, is that they didn't feel listened to, but at the same time they didn't feel like they would know who to vote for, or even how to vote. Like, there were questions around, do you vote at a computer? Can you do it online? Do you like really no understanding of the process? And so yeah, that was a very much. And then there were politics students who'd studied politics, who were really, really very well informed and could kind of hold forth on the role of the European Commission and all sorts of things. So there is such a huge um, inconsistency, and part of that is to do with the nature of the provision that they've had before. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah, and I assume also because in education we often equate education with schooling, but there's also what happens at home, right? Like
Yeah.
the home environment is equally important, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And they were very open about reflecting on that. My participants were very, some of them said, oh, we watch the news at home, we talk about it. and some were like, never discuss it. It's, it's just, we don't talk about politics, we don't talk about the environment, so yeah, even whether or not they discuss it, let alone the viewpoints that are then expressed, which obviously has a massive impact.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And your point about like young people saying, why do adults hate us or so scared? I think for me that's why I love working with teenagers, is because I I find it fascinating that so many adults are scared of them.
Yeah, yeah. I it's the thing, having not working in schools, it's the thing that I miss the most, is that just, yeah, teenagers are fantastic.
They're a joy, aren't they?
Mm.
Particularly if you get that trust and that connection, like you've established this relationship with them. They just, yeah, it's absolutely the best. Like I'm doing some graduate teaching work this term, and being in seminars with the young people, particularly once they let go of part of their conditioning, and you create a space where you just
Mm.
go, it's okay to make mistakes here. We just, it's not performative. I don't want you to think that you have to create your best answer ever, all of those things.
Yeah.
They just relax. Like every week I watch them, and they just like relax, and they sort of start having those conversations, and they're so wise. They've got so many,
Mm.
things they can share.
Yeah. Yeah, they're hugely underestimated as a chunk of society, like hugely underestimated, I think.
Mm.
Um, and I think a lot of sort of the conceptions of them as being naive is, yeah, I mean, sure, like life experience, you gain more of it as you get older. Of course you do, because you've just lived longer. But just because you've lived longer, it doesn't mean that your experience is any more valid or important or insightful to anyone else. I think hugely underestimated. I'd never considered in the same way as I had when before talking to my participants about the fact that our definitions of these things, and when you were saying about the difference between citizenship and global citizenship, one group was like, well, I can't possibly define it or give a or no rate a definition as better than another, because these definitions are to do with what it is rather than what it could be, and I'm interested in what it could be. And it's like, gosh, that, yes, brilliant, that's great, so am I think that's fantastic. And also this idea of performance activism, which came out of a conversation between a group of young people. I was like, that's such a brilliant, yeah, there were so many things that they said that just gave me a different way of looking at it. I've learned so much, not just in terms of doing a PhD, but I've learned so much that I've taken on board through working with them. So it's been a real privilege in that sense.
Amazing. And so, yes, I look forward to reading the PhD once you've published it, or maybe you can come back when you can share all your results. That'd be quite cool.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Um, so I've got that question around like the social justice, and in particular like the
Yes.
global citizenship. So
Mm.
I think in part that's for me, because I used to teach languages, and I used to teach French and Spanish. Um, and in that curriculum, there is so much that's not challenged in terms of the language of the colonizer, and
Mm.
all of those things. Um, and I've always felt really strongly about that. So when I was teaching languages, I've always encouraged the young people to sort of think about like even the language we use, right? Like long before we started sort of in higher education, we're talking about decolonizing the curriculum. When you hear people say, of course, Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas, you're like,
Mm.
not quite, right? So, I mean, in terms of, I'm really interested and sort of curious in terms of what these young people may have said, in terms of even like the UN sustainable sort of goals and all of those things. Did they have any comments on those elements in terms of the global, and whose global perspective are we looking at? And
Yeah, so I think yes. So the form that the research took was, it was a photo voice project. So we had a workshop at the beginning, which is kind of what I've drawn on a lot in our conversation so far, where we just talked about citizenship before they went out and took photographs, because they needed to position themselves within that debate. And so we did that. And then they went off and they took photographs in their local area. So of something that resonated with this conversation they'd had around citizenship. And they then wrote a caption and a title for that, for the chosen photograph. And interestingly, quite a few of these pictures of very local things, very local places, threw up conversations around colonialism, around international social justice issues or international boundaries, migration, the problems of citizenship as a boundaried concept. They came up. It was definitely something which wasn't precluded just because we were looking at the local area, which I had hoped that would happen, but you have no way of kind of knowing. So kind of inevitably in Bristol, I suppose there was reference to Colston, and we had that reference to, there was somebody took a picture of the Bristol Beacon and talked about how the city was built on slave money and how the country's developed through colonialism. And that they referenced that it was traffic jam outside of the Bristol Beacon, and that was the question that they raised for the audience. This is another evidence of bureaucracy within this colonial system. There were comments around migration and around quite literal things around different religions or around the journeys that migrants have taken to get here, but also metaphorical things around hope, new starts, national, adopting another identity, but also conversations around how actually what was important in terms of being a citizen, in terms of having an identity, was about retaining links to other people, whether that be national links, whether that be international links, and not in a sort of thin sense of charity or of fundraising, which is kind of where we very much look at our active citizenship in schools, but in a very real and human sense that we are a community, that the things that bind us together are, it might be art, it might be food, it might be religion, it might be a shared grief or a shared conflict that we can all feel something about. So another thing that was a picture of lots of Palestinian flags that was taken in the middle of a protest that someone had been part of, and they asked the question of the audience who would view it, what happens when we come together for something that is meaningful for us as humans, not just as us as individuals. So I feel that there is a real potential in looking at local, very specific, as I say, it's all in Bristol, and the young people were quite open about owning their images and having their names on them. They from a consent point of view and an ethics point of view, it would be wrong of me to take their work and exhibit it without giving them the opportunity to take credit for the questions that they're asking, because that's what's important to them. And so I think that the social justice element definitely came into it locally, and how that spread out was really lovely to see.
Yeah, and it's lovely because what I'm hearing, it's also like the importance of the localized, the localized and then the global, in a sense that in the localized as in Bristol, but then looking at how Bristol is a city that has been built on colonial, coloniality and everything that it involves, and a lot of the buildings are representative of that, right? Even the university we doing our PhD for, they've got a reparative futures sort of program, and they've got the work of Marianne Gournet, and some of our even academics in the school are involved in that, aren't they?
Absolutely. And its logo changed I was talking to the third year group that I work with, graduate teacher, and we were talking about the removal of the dolphin from the university logo because it related to Colston, and as now Bristol feels we can shed that particular allegiance. So too does the university, which is, in my opinion, great to see. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really awesome because it just, it's almost like these young people are leading the way. I mean, like, even though we're not asking them to solve the problem of, like we said, I think it's also it sometimes it's finding that balance, is going back to like, what do I do with my findings, right? Like creating this space that's so open and lovely, and then like the system that's quite sort of strict and constructed, in between. It's also the same with like these young people. It's quite like, although I love teenagers, I would never also idolize them or put them on a pedestal and turn them into these amazing, like, oh, they have all the answers. I think it's really important that it's intergenerational. Would you agree with that?
Oh, 100%. Yes. And I think that that's perhaps the thing, when we do this kind of thing in schools, we do impose a very flat kind of, in terms of age groups. We are very, even within schools, you have year 7, 8, 9, 10, these conversations that they're having, even if they are having them, are within a very flat. And the only input from a different age group will be from an authority figure, which doesn't necessarily help the cause of an intergenerational conversation. So I would agree. And I also think that not idolizing them is really important. Like, that it's important to say that some of the young people that I spoke to were, a lot of them had political views that I obviously, I'm not going to bring my political views to bear in the conversation, but that I may think, oh, I agree with you. That's there were some who obviously I didn't, and who they didn't agree with each other. There was some quite strong debates around, for example, sovereignty and the UK, and the UK as 4 nations rather than being England. And there were real disagreements, but they weren't aggressive. They were seen as an opportunity to sort of debate and have those conversations, which I suppose that was a lovely thing, in that even where there were things that were challenging, the way that they dealt with it was just so impressive in those conversations. Really, really impressive. And a conversation I had with some students, that I took the results, I took the data to another group of post-16 students to have a conversation around what they thought about it and their experiences of citizenship. And a lot of them were saying, well, we just don't know how to talk about this stuff. Like, what would be really important to us would be the opportunity to learn about debate. We're afraid that we're going to offend somebody, or we're afraid that we'll say the wrong thing. We don't know how to express ourselves without it being provocative, in a bad way. I mean, you can be provocative in a good way and spark discussion, but they were concerned, especially, there were a lot of images in my data around LGBTQ plus rights, and they felt that was a subject that they couldn't discuss because they didn't know how to approach it. They didn't want to come across as disrespectful or overly woke, or all of these things that were just going around in their heads. So yeah, and I don't think you can teach people like how to have that discussion without having discussions. I think you need to create the safe space. I think that's what's important.
Yeah, and this is also an echo with like my PhD. So my approach is a dialogue or phenomenological inquiry. So I believe dialogue, like this podcast, one imperfectly perfect conversation at a time. And so, like, creating those spaces where we can have those imperfectly perfect conversation where we may disagree, or we may, dialogue is so important. And again, like in schools, because we don't have time, and because the curriculum is so crammed, right? Like, the time and space means that there's no dialogue. It's usually like a teacher at the front that tells you what you've got to do and you do the work. And so it's not surprising that they can't. I mean, interestingly, I didn't know until I started really exploring all the different, particularly when my eldest said he didn't want to be, continuing to doing his GCSEs and stuff in mainstream, and we had to home educate him for 3 years. I started looking at independent schools, and I don't know if you know, but for example, Eton has a mini parliament in.
Right.
So So they're trained to
Yeah.
do parliamentary sessions, you
Mm.
know. So and then people said to me, Fabian, why do you not like independent schools? And I'm like, it's not that I don't like independent schools. It's just like give Eton experience to all children, and then I'll be happy.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the students last year, one of the undergraduates that I was teaching and the unit, they had said to me, but just like, so, if you step back and you think about it, you're paying for, in inverted commas, better education. So you pay for something better than the state offers. They're like, in some contexts, that sort of sounds a bit like corruption, doesn't it? I sort of went, oh, I hadn't thought about it like that. But that idea that, they're paying to go to Eton, and then as a result of that, they then get schooled in parliamentary processes, and then that seems, yeah, that's an interesting process. Yeah.
And also the network that they then get
Yeah.
access to, right? Beyond
Yeah.
everything else.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely problematic.
Yeah, very, I believe. People may disagree, of course.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah.
So, Pen, I'm conscious that I've asked you loads of questions. Is there a question I haven't asked you that you're sitting here thinking, oh, I so wish Fabian had asked me this?
No, because I think it's just been really nice to just take the conversation as it's gone. I think I am very aware that because it's all in my mind at the moment and I'm sort of writing and bringing things together, I feel like my answers ping off all over the place. So I feel like I probably answered any questions I would like to have been asked in my own ramblings.
Well, they weren't rabblings. They made complete sense, and it sounds amazing. And the invitation is there when you feel ready, because you've finished and submitted and done the Viva and stuff. If there's anything you want to come back and share in terms of your findings, you will be very welcome.
Oh, thank you. That's really lovely.
Yeah, wonderful. So as we wrap up, is there something that you're taking with you from this conversation that you'd not really thought about, and or that you would like to leave us with?
I think given the opportunity to actually talk about the experiences I've had with the young people and reflect on them has been really important. I did the field work, as I say, over a year ago now, and it's become not abstract or, but I have gained distance from it, and it's been very powerful to think again about the young people as individuals and as humans, as well as as well as the photographs that they took and the text that they wrote as data. So it's been really nice to make that connection explicit again. That's been really positive. So thank you for that.
No, well, thank you for sharing. Is there anything like from your research, or like a lot of uh the listeners to this podcast are a bit like me, so mums who are either recovering teachers or and or not recovering but just teachers, like so mothers and teachers mainly, some young people, are there specific things that you would want to also leave them with so they can ponder on?
I think the thing that I think we should all be thinking about is how we create a safe space for discussion. I think we're in such a difficult, politically charged time at the moment where it seems that you can't move for, various views or potentially not extremist, but fairly extreme viewpoints. And I think what we all need to be thinking about is how we give the young people that we are in contact with, whether we're parents or teachers or aunts or whatever we are, how we validate their viewpoint, and also um, how we give them the skills to gently challenge what they're told by the media or by friends or by social media, and to have confidence that their views you know are worthy, and that they are perfectly entitled to challenge.
Mm.
Yeah. So I think we all need, I certainly as a mum, you know, that's something that I think about a lot with, I've got a preteen, and you know, it's very important to me that he understands that he can gently challenge the things that come his way that he doesn't believe are right. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, amazing. And I think, yeah, I agree with you. I think for me, this is what we've tried to create as a family, but also as an invitation. It's sort of like, sometimes I wish I'd not created that space though, because my two are really not afraid of challenging me. And going, I'm hearing this and I'm seeing this. Which one is it, Mum? Because it can't be both.
Yeah,
So,
it's double-edged sword.
yes, it is. But you know, as my, like, one of my supervisors said to me, she said, well, you can be also quite proud because it sounds like you've created this space where they feel safe enough, right? Like
Yeah,
psychologically safe, that they can. So imagine if we could create spaces like that for all young people, that'd be amazing, right?
it would. Yeah, it would be really amazing.
Amazing. Well, good luck with the writing up and the finishing of your thesis, and hopefully, yeah, you can come back for round two when you're ready to share all of it with us.
Yeah, I would love that.
Take care.
Thank you, and you.